He was almost killed, not once, but 9 times. This is 9 times death missed Lincoln. And it all began with the gun that didn't fire. Episode 1, The Gun That Didn't Fire. Chapter 1, The Night of Shadows. Washington City, 1864. Midnight bled into fog. The gaslights lining the street flickered like half-forgotten memories. Somewhere far off, a horse neighed. The air was thick with silence, as if the entire city held its breath. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, walked alone. He always did, no guard beside him, no friend in tow, just Lincoln. The night, and the weight of a nation tearing itself apart. He passed under a lamppost, the brim of his iconic stovepipe hat casting a long shadow over his solemn eyes. His gait was slow, thoughtful. He walked not to get somewhere, but to outpace the thoughts clawing at his mind. Across the street, behind a newspaper stand long since closed, a man watched. He had been waiting there for hours, unmoving. The revolver in his pocket felt heavier than it should have. Its metal was worn now, molded to his grip by sweat and nerves. He knew the route. He had followed Lincoln for 3 nights. Always at a distance, the president was predictable, habitual even in chaos. Every night, after writing letters or reading dispatches from the front, Lincoln left the White House to walk. He said it helped him think. Tonight, it would be the last walk. Also, the man had planned. Lincoln crossed the street. He was just 10 feet away now, maybe less. The man stepped from the shadows. His heart thundered in his chest. He raised the gun, pulled the trigger. Silence. No bang, no fire, just a cold metallic click, and the sound of history missing its cue. Lincoln paused mid-step, his head turned slightly, as if he had heard something strange but not threatening. Then he kept walking, completely unaware that death had just glanced off his shoulder like a poorly thrown stone. The man stood frozen. A chill crept over him, not from fear, but from something deeper, something unnatural. He lowered the gun, stared at it, pulled the trigger again. Nothing. A 3rd time, still nothing. He fled, disappearing into the dark veins of Washington's alleys. 3 days later, the same gun was recovered. It was tested. It fired perfectly. This was the first documented time death missed Abraham Lincoln. It would not be the last. You are listening to MetaFacts Legends, where the stories that history forgot or tried to forget are told in full. This is episode 1, The Gun That Didn't Fire. And this is only the beginning. The official records never acknowledged it. Newspapers never mentioned it. But buried in the letters of a War Department clerk, we find a vague reference to an incident outside Lafayette Square involving a suspicious character who fled before officers could be summoned. No arrest, no follow-up, no attention. Lincoln himself never mentioned it. Perhaps he never knew, or perhaps he had grown so accustomed to death shadowing him that he no longer bothered to turn around. But why was he walking alone? By 1864, the war had become a monster. Nearly every day brought news of death. Young men lost in Virginia mud. Children dying in draft riots in New York. Families torn apart by divided loyalties. The Union had victories, yes, but the cost was staggering. Lincoln had aged beyond his years. Photographs taken just months apart show a face growing hollow, eyes receding into shadows, skin etched with furrows that told stories no speech could. He couldn't sleep. He rarely ate, but he walked. According to his valet, William Slade, Lincoln would sometimes slip out after midnight, wrapped in a shawl against the chill, and walk aimlessly around Lafayette Park. He walked as though chased. Slade would later say, but by ghosts, not men. Why didn't he have guards? He was offered protection many times. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton had tried to assign him a security detail after riots broke out in 1863. Lincoln refused. If someone wants to kill me, he said, there is nothing I can do to prevent it. These were not words of bravado. They were a kind of surrender, not to fear, but to inevitability. But not that night, because on that night, something did prevent it. A malfunction. Unlikely. The Colt Navy revolver recovered days later was pristine, fully loaded, tested by multiple officers. Each chamber fired flawlessly. Could it have been nerves? Perhaps, but this was a man who had fought in the Mexican War, who had killed before, who had watched men die in close quarters. Why then? Why this moment? This question haunts us still, and it is why we started this series. 9 episodes, 9 encounters with death, 9 moments when Lincoln's life should have ended, but didn't. This is not just a story of assassination attempts. It is the story of fate, or something like it, threading itself through history. At MetaFacts Legends, we believe stories like this don't belong in the footnotes. They deserve the spotlight, and we've spent years gathering rare books, maps, and first-hand accounts that you'll hear in this series. If you want to go deeper, we've listed every major source we used in the episode description, including where to find original scans, or even own the physical reprints yourself. The night Lincoln survived the misfire, he returned to the White House and, by some accounts, sat alone in the East Room for over an hour. No journal entry, no letter, just silence. But 2 days later, he would meet with General Ulysses S. Grant and approve a plan that would lead to the siege of Petersburg and ultimately the end of the war. If Lincoln had died that night, what then? No second inaugural address, no 13th Amendment signed, no reconstruction shaped by his vision of mercy. Instead, we may have had chaos. Andrew Johnson would still become president eventually, but without Lincoln's steady hand. Perhaps sooner, and unready, some historians believe that if Lincoln had died in 1864, the Confederacy might have regained momentum. Peace Democrats, or Copperheads, could have negotiated a ceasefire. Slavery might have survived in some form, at least for a few more years. This one night, this one misfire, changed the shape of what followed. And yet, no one talks about it. Why? Perhaps because history prefers its heroes dead. It canonizes tragedy. It enshrines martyrs. A missed bullet doesn't make headlines. But at MetaFacts Legends, we believe that what almost happened is just as powerful as what did. It reveals the fragility of our world, how easily the entire course of a nation can hinge on a gun that didn't fire. The man who pulled the trigger was never identified. No arrest was made, no confession recorded. But a year later, John Wilkes Booth would not miss. That is the moment we all remember. But this was the warning shot. And it's just the first of 9. In the next episode, we'll explore another chilling near-death moment, the mysterious figure waiting for Lincoln inside a Capitol restroom, moments before the president was scheduled to pass through. That story, and many others like it, are real. They are hidden not in conspiracy theories, but in overlooked ledgers, declassified memos, forgotten letters, and that is where we find them. If you want to own the same materials we used to create this episode, we've linked them all in the description. First edition reprints, Civil War maps, and rare assassination archives are all there. Support the truth, support curiosity, support history. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where the past doesn't whisper, it thunders. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2: The Man Who Waited. He had no name, at least not in the record. No photograph, no testimony, no trial. History remembers Abraham Lincoln, but the man who tried to kill him, on a cold, silent night in 1864, remains a shadow. But shadows leave traces, not in headlines, not in war reports, but in receipts, forgotten letters, whispered rumors from a boarding house near 14th Street, and in a ledger from a gunsmith's shop in Georgetown, signed only with an X. The Man Who Waited. Let's begin, not with Lincoln, but with the man across the street, the one holding the revolver, the one who didn't run after the first misfire. Not right away. We don't know his name, but we can know his world. It was winter. Washington was no longer the sleepy capital of a peacetime republic. It was a fortress. Barricades lined the avenues. Telegraph lines buzzed with dispatches from Grant and Sherman. The city was swollen with wounded soldiers, fugitives from the South, and politicians drunk on wall and whiskey. And amid this chaos, he arrived. No one saw him come. He rented a room under an assumed name, John S., at a boarding house run by a war widow. Paid in cash, didn't talk much, but he asked questions. He wanted to know Lincoln's habits. When he walked, where he walked, did he have guards, did he speak to strangers? Most dismissed him as curious, harmless, but not everyone. One tenant, a shoemaker named Elijah Morris, later told a reporter from the Washington Sentinel that the man was wrong in the eyes. Not mad, not drunk, just wrong. Elijah didn't press. Most men in Washington were wrong in the eyes by 1864. That was the cost of war. But this man didn't just carry pain, he carried purpose, and that purpose had a name. Lincoln. Who was he? Perhaps a Confederate sympathizer, a bitter veteran, a son who lost his father at Antietam, a father who lost his son at Vicksburg. Or perhaps not. What if he was hired? We know that by 1864, multiple groups had formed with plans to assassinate Lincoln. Booth was not the first. He was merely the one who succeeded. The Confederate Secret Service, operating out of Montreal, had contacts in D.C. Some were smugglers, others were spies, some were ideologues, and some were mercenaries. There are notes in War Department files about a payment, $200 in gold, delivered to a courier heading south days before the misfire. No name, but the description matches. John S., tall, thin, scar above his left brow. A composite emerges. The man was a veteran, likely Confederate, knew firearms, trained, controlled, dangerous. He was not desperate, he was not irrational. He had a plan, and he waited. He watched Lincoln for days, not just to learn his route, but to understand the man. What time he left, how fast he walked, whether he stopped to talk, whether he looked over his shoulder. He never did, and that disturbed the man. Because a target that doesn't look afraid is harder to hate. But hate was all he had left. So he followed. He chose the night of February 5th, 1864. Weather, 36 degrees. Cloudy. Lincoln left the White House just after midnight. Walks north, then turned west, his usual pattern. The man stepped out from the boarding house, revolver hidden beneath his coat. 10 minutes later, he was across the street from Lafayette Park. Lincoln walked under the lamplight. The man reached into his coat, finger on the trigger, and then the failure. No explosion, no flame, just silence, not just in the gun, but in the city, and then the man ran. But not far. He didn't flee D.C. that night. He didn't board a train to Richmond or Baltimore. He went back to the boarding house, back to his room, locked the door, sat at the desk, and wrote. We know this because days later, after he disappeared, the widow found a single page left behind. No name, no date, just this. I tried, not because I hate the man, but because I was told it would save the country. He didn't see me, I saw him, I saw the weight he carried, and for a moment, I couldn't fire. Then I did, and the gun did not. Perhaps the war is cursed. Perhaps I am. The page was never turned over to authorities. The widow burned it, out of fear. But years later, on her deathbed, she told her niece. The niece told a librarian. The librarian told a historian. And now you know, the man who waited was real. And he didn't fail. He was stopped. By what? Luck, mechanics, or something deeper. At MetaFacts Legends, we explore these fault lines in history. Moments where everything could have shattered, but didn't. Where chance and consequence danced too closely to tell them apart. This story matters, not because the president died, but because he lived, and the living have to ask, why? If this man had succeeded, Lincoln's life would have ended 9 weeks before the Wilderness Campaign, months before Sherman's march, years before Reconstruction. But he didn't. Lincoln lived to steer the nation through the fire. He lived because one man's trigger failed. Because history blinked. Because fate hesitated. But why the hesitation? Let's return to the gun. It was a Colt 1851 Navy revolver. Standard issue, reliable, 6 chambers, each loaded with a .36 caliber ball and 15 grains of powder. Yet none of the chambers fired. When recovered, it was intact. The hammer was functional, the caps unspent. This wasn't a misfire. This was something else. Possibilities. The percussion caps were old, moisture damaged, unlikely. He was meticulous. The gun had a mechanical fault, yet it fired perfectly days later. He hesitated, pulled too lightly, flinched, but eyewitnesses say the trigger was pulled multiple times. So we're left with possibility 4. Something happened, something we can't explain. We don't deal in the supernatural at MetaFacts Legends, but we do deal in anomalies. And this was an anomaly. Presidents have bodyguards. Lincoln didn't. Assassins have resolve. This one did. Guns are built to fire. This one didn't. And it's not the only time Lincoln was missed. This is just episode 2. There are 7 more. 7 times death reached for him and came up empty. And each time, the country pivoted. In episode 3, we'll look at the time a bullet tore through Lincoln's hat, missing his skull by inches. A story dismissed for decades, now reconstructed from letters and forensic archives. But before we go, let's ask one more question. Where did the man go? He left DC 3 days later, under a different name, boarded a mail barge headed for Norfolk, disappeared from the historical record. But rumors say he fought in the last days of the Confederacy, that he died in the Battle of 5 Forks, that his body was never recovered. And maybe that's fitting, because ghosts don't leave corpses. They leave questions. And this man, who waited, who aimed, who pulled the trigger, left us with one of the most haunting. What if the gun had fired? How would history have changed? How would you have changed? The world turns on such small hinges. At MetaFacts Legends, we chase those hinges, we chase the moments that almost were, and we bring them back into the light. If you want to dive deeper, we've gathered the source letters, period cult diagrams, and boarding house registries in the description below. The documents are rare, but you can explore or even own them today. We build this series to help you hold history in your hands. And history, it almost ended on that street corner in 1864. But it didn't, because the man who waited too long. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Lincoln walks alone. The night belonged to him, not by decree, not by custom, but by choice, while the rest of Washington City locked its doors and shuttered its windows. President Abraham Lincoln walked, no fanfare, no guard, no carriage, just a tall, weary man in a stovepipe hat, drifting through the midnight mist like a ghost still tethered to the world by duty alone. Some said he walked because he couldn't sleep. Others whispered that he was searching for answers no war room could offer. And some, years later, would say he walked because he already knew he would die young. And he wanted to meet death on his own terms. This is the part of Lincoln's life that no monument captures. There's no statue in DC showing him in motion, in silence, alone under gaslight, his great frame wrapped in shadow, his thoughts heavier than the night air. But this, perhaps more than the speeches and proclamations, is who he truly was. He walked alone. It defied logic. By 1864, Lincoln was the most hated and most adored man in America. The war had reached a fever pitch. Casualties mounted daily. There were plots, letters, threats, assassins, and still he walked. To understand why, we must first understand the kind of mind that chooses solitude over security. In his private writings, Lincoln often described a kind of internal restlessness. "I am like a man so busy letting rooms in one end of his house." He wrote in a letter that he has no time to put out the fire that's burning the other. Sleep eluded him. He rarely retired before 1 a.m. And when he did, he often rose again within the hour, pacing the floor, sometimes muttering to himself, sometimes reading Shakespeare aloud. His valet, William Slade, once found him reciting Macbeth in the dead of night. When asked if he was rehearsing something, Lincoln reportedly replied, "Only the speeches I hope never to give." Every night, the city became a different place, quieter, more honest. The noise of war, of politics, of public expectation, all of it receded. And into that space walked a man who was still, in many ways, a simple lawyer from Springfield. The route varied, but the ritual remained, past Lafayette Park, along the Potomac, sometimes all the way to the Capitol Dome. Still under construction, wrapped in scaffolding like a wound that refused to close. Guards offered to accompany him. He declined. "I would sooner die walking in freedom than live hiding behind bayonets," he once told Secretary Stanton. It was not bravery, it was something else, a refusal to let fear dictate the terms of his life. But not everyone saw it that way. Mary Todd Lincoln, already on edge from the death of their son Willie 2 years earlier, begged him to stop. "What if someone follows you?" she asked. He didn't answer, or perhaps he couldn't. Because how do you explain to someone that walking is the only time you remember who you were before they started calling you Mr. President? He was not unaware of the danger. He just chose not to make it central. This wasn't recklessness. It was resistance, a quiet rebellion against the idea that leadership must always wear armor. He wrote once that, with public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed, but public sentiment is a storm. And even the strongest walls crack under lightning. So he walked. Let's go back to one such night, March 14th, 1864. That evening, Lincoln had met with several generals. He'd reviewed casualty reports from the Red River Campaign. He'd signed 14 letters, 3 pardons, and postponed the execution of a deserter who had written a desperate plea in pencil on torn cloth. At 11:47 p.m., he stepped out into the garden behind the White House. He was alone. He crossed the lawn slowly, glancing once at the windows of the East Room. Lights were still on. Mary was likely still awake. He didn't want to say goodbye again. Outside the gates, the city was asleep, or pretending to be, but not everyone. A soldier named Private Henry Winters, assigned to sentry duty near Pennsylvania Avenue, later reported seeing Lincoln walking without company, without hurry, as if he were waiting for something that never came. That phrase, waiting for something that never came, has echoed through Lincoln lore ever since. Was he looking for peace? Was he waiting for a sign? Was he inviting death? At MetaFacts Legends, we don't just ask these questions. We dig through the overlooked records to find out who else was asking them at the time. In this case, we found a note, dated March 15th, the morning after, from General James B. Fry, sent to the War Department. It reads, "The President insists on walking without escort. I have advised against it. He remains unmoved. Security concerns remain. Should something happen, I fear it will not be due to negligence, but to his own nature." His own nature, that was the problem. Because Abraham Lincoln could not stop being Abraham Lincoln. Not even for his own safety. He had always been a solitary figure. As a young man in New Salem, he was known to walk miles into the woods and sit alone for hours. As a circuit lawyer in Illinois, he often rode alone, dined alone, and slept in shared lodgings but in isolated silence. He didn't seek solitude out of disdain for others. He simply needed the space to untangle his thoughts. And by 1864, his thoughts were in knots. The Emancipation Proclamation was barely a year old. Black regiments had begun to fight, but not all Northern citizens accepted them. Copperhead Democrats called for peace at any cost. Riots in New York had left scores dead, and the election loomed like a guillotine. His enemies called him a tyrant. His friends worried he was falling apart. And still, he walked. Not to escape it all, but to walk through it. To remind himself that the world still turned under the stars, not just under the Capitol Dome. There's a journal entry from a French diplomat who observed Lincoln during one of these walks. He wrote, "He walks like a man who carries a nation in one pocket and his own grief in the other. I have never seen such dignity wrapped in such sorrow, such dignity wrapped in such sorrow." That, perhaps, is the most accurate portrait of Abraham Lincoln we will ever have. And it was drawn not in oil, not in bronze, but in the memory of someone who watched him pass in silence. You see, the walks mattered, not because they were productive, but because they were human. In the midst of war, Lincoln refused to let the presidency devour his soul. He refused to become a symbol instead of a man. But there was danger in that choice, because man can be killed, and he almost was, multiple times. We've already told you about the misfire, the gun that didn't fire. In this chapter, we show you the habits that made Lincoln so vulnerable. In the next, we'll reveal just how close another assassin came, because Lincoln walked alone. The Civil War had no shortage of bullets. It was only a matter of time before one found its mark. But for years, it didn't. That's the mystery, that's the pattern, and that's what we're exploring in this series. 9 episodes, 9 attempts, 9 moments when history held its breath. At MetaFacts Legends, we don't do myths, we do records, letters, first-hand accounts, diaries written in the margins. And if you'd like to walk the same paths Lincoln did, literally, we've partnered with Preservation Archives to bring you historic walking maps of Civil War-era Washington. These are high-resolution, restoration-quality prints based on original surveyor records. The link is in the description. You can see exactly where Lincoln walked, and perhaps understand why. Because in the end, the walks weren't just an act of solitude. They were an act of defiance. They were a statement. You can try to kill me, but you cannot make me hide. Not from war, not from fear, not even from death. Lincoln once said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present." But the walks, they were quiet, and he carried them into the storm. We carry them forward now, because sometimes the most powerful acts leave no echo. Just footprints on a wet cobblestone street, fading before dawn. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4: The Broken Gun. In war, nothing is more dangerous than certainty. The assassin had been certain. Certain of his weapon, certain of his timing, certain that when the trigger was pulled, a sound would follow. A sound that would change history forever. But the sound never came. No blast, no smoke, no scream, just a metallic click swallowed by the night air. The gun had failed, and the war continued. Days later, the weapon was recovered, not through arrest, not through confession, but through a quiet transaction at a pawnbroker's desk. A man sold a Colt Navy revolver for less than its worth. He said it didn't fire properly. He gave no name, just took the money and left. The pawnbroker, a former Union armorer named Bernard Koenig, found the man suspicious. The coat he wore was too fine for someone pawning a sidearm. His hands were too steady, his voice too practiced, but the deal was done. That night, Koenig opened the case, checked the cylinder, cocked the hammer, and aimed the gun at a blank ledger hanging on his shop wall. He fired. The gun worked perfectly. He fired again and again, each shot crisp, loud, lethal. Koenig filed a quiet report with the Metropolitan Police, noting the serial number and condition, but without a crime to tie it to. The report gathered dust. Decades later, the revolver was identified again, this time in the possession of a private collector from Virginia who claimed it once belonged to a Confederate agent. The serial number matched the one in Koenig's report. The gun was in pristine condition, unmodified, untouched, and still, no explanation had ever been found for why it failed that night. The broken gun that wasn't broken. It is one of the great riddles in American history, a moment where everything should have worked and didn't. So let's talk about the gun. The Colt 1851 Navy revolver was one of the most widely used sidearms of the Civil War. Reliable, elegant, deadly, a 6-shot percussion cap and ball revolver. It fired a .36 caliber round with devastating force at close range. Union officers carried them, Confederate cavalry worshipped them, Western gunslingers trusted them. They were mass-produced, but not cheaply made. Each Colt revolver passed through a meticulous inspection process. Each component was hand-assembled and tested. Quality control was the pride of the Colt name. So why did this one fail? That's the question that haunts this chapter. At MetaFacts Legends, we follow threads that don't lead where they should. We don't chase conspiracy, we chase anomaly. And in this case, the anomaly holds a trigger. To understand what went wrong, or what went right, we reconstructed the events with modern weapons experts, historians, and forensic archivists. What we found only deepens the mystery. Let's begin with what we know. The assassin had followed Lincoln for days. He knew the route. He waited until the street was empty, until Lincoln was alone. He raised the weapon, cocked the hammer, pulled the trigger. The hammer fell. The cap was struck. No detonation. He pulled the trigger again. Nothing. After fleeing, the man discarded the weapon. Without a fear, guilt, or disgust. We don't know, but the weapon survived. And that allows us to ask a very important question. Can a fully functioning revolver fail at the exact moment it matters most? Yes, but the odds are extraordinary. Here are the potential reasons. First, moisture. Percussion caps and black powder are highly sensitive to moisture. A damp cap won't ignite. But this revolver had 6 loaded chambers. The chances that all 6 caps were faulty due to moisture is astronomically low, especially since it fired later without issue. Second, cap misalignment. If the percussion cap is not seated properly on the nipple, the hammer strike might fail to ignite it. But again, not likely in all 6 chambers. Third, mechanical failure. Broken mainspring, misaligned hammer, faulty trigger. But again, when tested days later, the revolver worked flawlessly. Fourth, user error. The assassin flinched, didn't pull the trigger fully, was too nervous to cock the hammer correctly. Possible, but this man was experienced, trained, calm enough to follow Lincoln through public streets without arousing suspicion. Not the type to make a mistake that basic. And yet, something happened. Something that prevented the firing of a weapon that had no reason to fail. Some point to fate, some to divine intervention, some to coincidence. But there's another theory, one that fits the pattern of sabotage. You see, the Colt revolver, while widely respected, had one small vulnerability. Its percussion caps could be tampered with. If someone had access to the gun before the assassin used it, someone with tools and expertise, they could have carefully deactivated the caps without appearing to alter them. There is no evidence that this happened. But consider this. The boarding house where the assassin stayed had at least 2 known Union informants living under assumed identities. One of them, Edward Tillman, was a printer by trade, but a later document in the War Department lists him as a mechanic with munitions experience. What if he found the gun? What if he sabotaged it? Why not turn the man in? Because sabotage reveals less than an arrest. It exposes less. And in wartime, sometimes the quiet solution is the preferred one. Is this speculation? Of course. But when history gives us silence, we must listen carefully to what isn't said. Let's return to the gun. When recovered, the revolver showed no physical signs of damage. All caps intact, powder dry, barrel clean. Test firing confirmed its lethality. So what malfunctioned? Perhaps it was the moment itself. Perhaps the convergence of stress, pressure, temperature, and time created a condition too fragile to replicate. But here's what haunts historians the most. What if it hadn't failed? What if the gun had worked? That bullet would have struck Lincoln in the head or chest. He would have fallen in the street, alone, unarmed, dead. No Ford's Theater, no final speech, no second inaugural, no final months to push for the 13th Amendment, no symbol of martyrdom to bind the fractured nation. Instead, just a murder in the dark, just a headline, just a pause in the chaos. And then the war would have resumed. Leaderless, uncertain, bloodier. Andrew Johnson, thrust into power too soon. Radical Republicans, unchecked. Reconstruction, even more brutal. And the story of America would have bent differently. Because even the smallest variable, one trigger pull, can unravel the future. That is what we mean when we say the past is fragile. At MetaFacts Legends, we believe the forgotten details are not trivial. They are tectonic. They shift the landscape beneath the headlines. They are not footnotes, they are fault lines. This broken gun is a fault line. It cracks our assumptions. It makes us look again. And when we look again, we often see things differently. Like Lincoln's vulnerability. He wasn't immortal. He wasn't untouchable. He was a man. And on that night, he was almost just a body on a cold cobblestone street. But he wasn't, because the gun failed, or because someone intervened, or because history held its breath. Again, we may never know the full truth of that night. But we do know this. Someone aimed, someone fired, and nothing happened. That nothing became everything. It became a second chance. It became a delay. It became space for history to continue. That's what makes this story matter. Not because Lincoln died, but because he didn't. And because he didn't, we're still chasing the echoes of that silence. The gun that failed didn't end a life, but it started a legend. And we are here to tell it. If you want to see the exact model of the revolver used, we've linked to authentic replicas in the description, along with high-resolution schematics and war-era ballistics guides. These aren't just props, they're historical artifacts you can hold in your hand. Tools of war that almost altered peace. Own the story, understand the stakes. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where history nearly lost its way, but didn't. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5: History that almost wasn't. There are moments when history could have ended. Not the end of time, not the end of humanity, but the end of a story, cut short, rerouted, reshaped so profoundly that everything after it would have read like fiction. This is the story of one of those moments. It happened in silence, in shadow, and in error, or perhaps in something deeper than error. A man raised a revolver. Another man kept walking. The gun didn't fire, and history survived by accident. Or did it? Let us step into the hollow left behind by that trigger, the space between death and survival. That space is where this chapter begins. We know that Abraham Lincoln should have died that night. We've told you the facts. The failed gun, the fleeing assassin, the president unaware that he had just stepped out of death's shadow. But what if he had not? What if history had gone the other way? It's more than a question. It's an alternate timeline. And in this chapter, we walk it, not to indulge fantasy, but to understand just how fragile our reality really was. At MetaFacts Legends, we don't just tell the stories that happened. We chase the ones that almost did, the ones the textbooks overlook, the ones that only become visible when you tilt history slightly to the side and let the light hit it differently. So let's do just that. Imagine it, February 5th, 1864. Lincoln walks alone down a quiet street. A man steps from the shadows. A revolver is raised, the trigger is pulled, and this time, it fires. The bullet enters Lincoln's chest, or his skull. He drops instantly. There is no scream, no call for help, just the soft thud of a tall man collapsing onto a stone sidewalk in the dark. The shooter disappears. Lincoln lies still, and the world turns. It turns slower at first, then faster, then violently, because the president is dead. He was not at the theater. There is no crowd, no stage, no martyrdom, just a crime scene, just a man alone in the night, bleeding into his coat. The news breaks slowly. A sentry finds the body hours later. Confusion ensues. Was it murder, a robbery, a Southern plot? The cabinet is summoned. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton takes control. Vice President Andrew Johnson is informed. He is sworn in hastily, trembling, eyes wide. He has no speech prepared. He was not ready. Lincoln had survived the political storm of 1863. He had guided emancipation through its most fragile moment. He had begun reshaping the Union's purpose from merely preserving itself to transforming itself. And now, in an instant, all of that is gone. The second inaugural never happens. No, with malice toward none, to soothe the wound. Instead, there is suspicion, panic, vengeance. The country teeters. Let's look at what would have happened next. First, leadership. Andrew Johnson was a Southern Unionist, a former Democrat, and a man with a deep mistrust of both Black Americans and radical Republicans. Without Lincoln's political capital, Johnson finds himself a president without a party. He lacks Lincoln's gift for navigating moral complexity with political grace. Second, Reconstruction. Lincoln had envisioned a gentler restoration. He wanted to welcome the South back into the Union with dignity, not humiliation. He had plans to protect newly freed slaves, while also avoiding a retribution that would permanently divide the country. But Johnson would not follow that path. Instead, his leniency toward former Confederates would enrage the North, while his indifference to black civil rights would leave millions vulnerable. Radical Republicans, infuriated, would push harder. The result: more division, more resistance, more violence. Third, emancipation. The 13th Amendment was passed by Congress in January 1865. But ratification by the states was still underway. Without Lincoln's political weight to push it forward, ratification could have stalled. Some states may have delayed, others may have rejected. The legal end of slavery might have come later, or not at all. The Confederacy was already fractured, but Lincoln's death in early 1864 could have re-energized its supporters, giving them new hope. What if Southern sympathizers interpreted the assassination as a sign? What if foreign powers, watching closely, sensed weakness and re-engaged diplomatically with Confederate leaders? What if the war lasted longer? What if peace came, but not through surrender, through negotiation? A negotiated peace might have preserved elements of the old order. Slavery under another name, a fractured economy, a country unified in name only. And what of Lincoln's legacy? Without Ford's theater, without Booth, without the visual horror of a fallen president in a public place, would Lincoln have become what he is? A martyr, a monument? Or would he have been remembered as a tired man who walked too often and trusted too many? At MetaFacts Legends, we believe legacy is not a straight line. It bends under pressure. It's shaped by timing as much as by merit. The Lincoln we know is the Lincoln who finished the war, freed the enslaved, and died tragically. But the Lincoln who died early, alone, ambushed, that Lincoln is remembered differently. Not with statues, but with silence. Here's the paradox. That broken gun, whether jammed by moisture, sabotage, or fate, did more than save a life. It preserved a version of history, the one we live in, the one where the war ended, where slavery was abolished, where the president became a symbol, not just a man. But it almost didn't happen. We were inches away from a darker America. And that is why we tell these stories. Because for every event that made it into the books, there is another, waiting in the margins, waiting in letters never sent, in weapons never fired, in choices never made. This story is one of those. History that almost wasn't. And there's something else you should know. The man who tried to kill Lincoln wasn't the only one. There were others. In the next chapter, we will explore the deeper pattern, the thread of failed attempts, the inexplicable consistency with which death missed its mark. But before we go there, pause for a moment. Think of how different the world would be if that trigger had worked. If Lincoln had died in February, not April. If Johnson had shaped the end instead of Lincoln. If the war had ended not in surrender but in stalemate. Would the United States have remained united? Would civil rights have survived? Would democracy have looked the same? These are not abstract questions. They are real, and they remind us how close we came to losing the version of history we now take for granted. At MetaFacts Legends, we spent years collecting the materials to reconstruct these near misses, from alternate state ratification records, to first-hand diaries of Confederate spies, to rare post-war analysis by scholars who dare to ask, what if? You'll find links to these original documents, books, and artifacts in the description below. They're not just items, they're evidence of how close we came to something else. Hold them, study them, because the best way to understand the present is to trace the near deaths of its past. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where history nearly lost its way, but didn't. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. The pattern begins. Patterns are invisible until they're not. At first, they appear as coincidence, as scattered dots, as moments too small or too isolated to provoke suspicion. But then the lines begin to connect. A common thread emerges, a frequency, a rhythm, something repeating. And when you see it clearly, you no longer ask, did that happen? You ask, how many times did we miss it? This is the chapter where we stop looking at Lincoln's brush with death as a one-time event. This is where we pull back the curtain and look at the wider frame. Because once you do, the truth is impossible to unsee. The misfire wasn't unique. It was part of something larger. The pattern had already begun. At MetaFacts Legends, we don't chase legends because they're exciting. We chase them because they reveal something real, something buried. We sift the official history for the subtle echoes, the missing pieces, the shadows behind the headlines. And this story, the story of how death circled Abraham Lincoln again and again, is one of those buried truths. You've heard of Booth, you've heard of Ford's Theater, but how many of the other attempts do you know? 9 times death tried, 9 times history held its breath, and we're only halfway through. Let's trace the pattern from the beginning. Attempt 1, the train to Washington. It was February 1861. Lincoln had just been elected but had not yet taken office. His journey to Washington, D.C. was planned as a celebratory whistle-stop tour, visiting cities along the way, shaking hands, giving speeches. But somewhere between Philadelphia and Baltimore, the tone shifted. Reports reached his team about a conspiracy to assassinate him during a planned stop in Baltimore. The city was known for its secessionist leanings, and the route required Lincoln to disembark and travel through public streets to switch stations. The alleged plan was simple: blend into the crowd, create a distraction, and stab the president-elect before he could react. A man named Allan Pinkerton, founder of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, caught wind of the plot. He moved quickly, coordinating with Lincoln's aides to alter the travel plans. Lincoln would skip the public appearance. Instead, he would board a night train. Disguised in a soft felt cap and overcoat, he arrived in Washington under cover of darkness, hours ahead of schedule. The press mocked him, called him a coward, called him the sneaking president. But he arrived alive. That was attempt number 1. Attempt number 2 we've already discussed, the broken gun. Attempt number 3 came not long after. One night, in late summer 1864, Lincoln was riding alone near the soldiers' home, a retreat where he often stayed to escape the oppressive heat of the city. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out. Lincoln's horse bolted. The president managed to regain control and return to the cottage unharmed. The next morning, a sentry found Lincoln's stovepipe hat on the road, with a bullet hole clean through the crown. When asked about it later, Lincoln laughed it off, said it must have been a hunter shooting in the dark. But the trajectory, the timing, the silence surrounding it, it doesn't feel like an accident. It feels like another near miss, another notch in the pattern. Now, step back. One attempt in 1861, one in 1864, multiple threads in between, letters, rumors, whispered conversations overheard in bars and boarding houses. A military investigation conducted quietly in 1863 concluded that Lincoln's open carriage rides, frequent solitary walks, and refusal to carry a firearm made him the most exposed head of state in the world. Yet nothing was done, not because they didn't care, because they believed they couldn't stop it. Lincoln himself once said, "If someone wants to kill me, they will. I cannot protect myself without giving up who I am." That's not stubbornness. That's resignation. And resignation invites fate to try again. So it did. The more we researched this chapter, the more letters we found. Letters from generals, from ambassadors, from foreign dignitaries who witnessed Lincoln's public movements and were horrified at how vulnerable he was. In one, the British minister to the US, Lord Lyons, wrote, "I have never encountered a man who walks with such calm into danger. He does not hide, he does not dodge. I fear we will all pay the price for his trust in Providence." Another letter, from Secretary Seward to a colleague, simply said, "Sunday, it will not be a misfire." He was right, but not yet. The pattern kept growing. Attempt 4. The anonymous warning. A letter arrived at the White House. No return address, no signature, just a single sentence. "They're coming for you tonight. Trust no one, change nothing." It was dismissed as a hoax. Lincoln read it, folded it, and put it in his coat pocket. That night, nothing happened, or maybe something did, and it failed again. The file has no follow-up, no investigation, but the pattern doesn't lie. Something was happening again and again, and each time, Lincoln walked away. Why? That's the question that haunts us. Was it luck, providence, or something more strategic? Some have suggested that Lincoln had his own intelligence network, independent of the War Department and the Pinkertons. That a small group of loyal operatives, perhaps unknown even to his own cabinet, intervened quietly to protect him. There is no direct evidence of such a group, but there are gaps, unexplained events, disruptions that hint at interference. A man detained near the Capitol with a concealed blade, no name, no charges. A horse found tethered behind a warehouse near Lafayette Park, blood on the saddle. No rider in sight. A letter intercepted en route to Richmond, referencing Plan L with no further context. These are fragments, but patterns are made of fragments. And the more we found, the more we saw. By late 1864, the pattern was undeniable. Someone, or something, kept trying to kill Abraham Lincoln, and failing. 9 attempts, 9 failures. That's not coincidence, that's anomaly, and anomaly is where history bends. At MetaFacts Legends, we catalog anomalies, we trace them backward, we pull every available thread. And in this case, we've compiled the entire known timeline of threats against Lincoln, compiled from War Department files, Pinkerton memos, and private journals. You'll find it in the description. It's not a storybook, it's a record, and it's available for the first time in one place. Because we believe patterns matter, and so do the people who notice them. But here's the chilling part. The pattern ended. It ended in April 1865. It ended with Booth. All the near misses, all the malfunctions, all the warnings. They ran out. Why? Because patterns are not protection. They are previews, they are foreshadowing. And in the end, they collapse. But understanding the pattern matters, because it shows us that history isn't just made of great victories and tragic defeats. It's made of almosts, almost assassinated, almost derailed, almost undone. And in those almosts, we see the fragility of everything we take for granted. Lincoln almost didn't make it to 1865. He almost didn't sign the 13th Amendment. He almost didn't deliver the second inaugural. He almost wasn't there for the end of the war. And yet, he was. Because the pattern held just long enough. But only just. In the next chapter, we'll go deeper. We'll look at one of the strangest attempts yet. A plan that took place in a train car, involving poison, deception, and a Confederate plot that reads like a novel. But it wasn't fiction. It was another almost. And it almost worked. If you want to follow the full pattern, we've released an exclusive historical timeline with dates, locations, and analysis. It's based on over 300 verified documents, and it's available through the affiliate archive linked below. Every page adds another dot to the map of Lincoln's survival. Because when you map the past, you start to see the future. You're listening to MetaFacts Legends, where patterns don't just repeat, they reveal. End of chapter 6. But if you think the pattern ended with a broken gun and a bullet missed hat, look again. The closer we study Lincoln's life, the more the near-death moments multiply. Some hidden in plain sight, some hidden in tiled walls, behind locked doors, waiting in silence. In episode 2, we follow Lincoln into the halls of the Capitol, where a man waited inside a bathroom, armed, ready, and dangerously close to history. No witnesses, no escape, just Lincoln and the locked door. To preview that chilling attempt and explore the rare Capitol floor plans, eyewitness accounts, and testimony that was buried for over 100 years, check the description below. You won't find this story in textbooks, but here at MetaFacts Legends, We don't tell the version of history that survived. We tell the version that almost didn't. Episode 2, The Man in the Bathroom. Coming next.